Welcome back to the Just As I Am podcast. It is your favorite friend, Nicole, and today we are going to be talking about somebody special. This person had a coat of many colors. We're going to be talking about Joseph, so stay tuned. So, if you've been with us the past couple of episodes, you know that I took a poll on my Facebook page, Just As I Am. Go find it, like it. That way you can keep up and give me insights, ideas, suggestions, whatever. Side note. Anyways, so I made a poll and asked what Bible story or what would you like to talk about next? And for some reason, I came up with like everything J related. I had Joseph, Job, Jacob, and Esau. I don't know where the J's came from, but they were there. Anyways, so the past two episodes, we went over Job's story. So now we're going to go over the second most voted for story, and that was the story of Joseph. So I tried to come up with a title for this episode that was just more than the story of Joseph or Joseph's story or whatever. So I kind of Googled, I was like, what are words that describe Joseph? And two words that came up were beloved and prophet. And I felt like that was a very good description of Joseph. And so this episode is entitled The Beloved Prophet. Now, we were in Job, like I said, so now we're going to go back to Genesis and talk about Joseph and his story. And like I kind of said in the intro, Joseph is probably best known for what his father gave him, and that was a coat of many colors. But Joseph was more than just a boy who had a coat of many colors, and we are fixing to dive deep on into that. So let's start in Genesis chapter 37 and go from there, shall we? What we know is that Joseph was the son of Jacob, whom some of you may know as Israel. When Jacob was 17, my goodness, I wrote crazy things in my notes. When Joseph was 17, he helped tend to the sheep with his brothers and the others. These others must have not been doing what they should have because Joseph told their fathers. Joseph was a tattletale. It is what it is. Joseph was the youngest and his dad's favorite. Raise your hand if you are your dad's favorite. I know you can't see me, but my hand is not raised. Although he says I am his favorite youngest daughter. He definitely loves my sister more. But he does show us love equally. I will say that. We're just loved differently. So, Joseph being his father's favorite, this really upset his brothers. You know, they probably could have cared less about what their moms had to say. Although, if you go back to Jacob, that is so funny that we're talking about Jacob and Esau was another choice. So, I guess we'll go back and talk about that later. But, anyways, because, Jacob tricked his father with his mother's help. Anyways, let's continue. So, Joseph had a dream one night about some grain. He had a dream that there were these, what do you call them? Stalks, reams, farmers, what do you call this? Of grain, and there was, let's see, he was one of 12, so at this point there was only 11, Anyways, there was one main one, and all the rest of them were bowing down to it, okay? That's essentially what his dream was. And this just fanned the flame. It made his brothers dislike him even more. Then he had the same dream, but with the sun, moon, and stars. They all revolved, they all bowed down. This did not help any either, although this really intrigued Jacob. Dad was like, okay. It caused even more jealousy between his brothers. So now Jacob sends Joseph to Shechem to see how his brothers are with the flock and report back. The brothers weren't there, they weren't where they were supposed to be, and they had moved to Dothan. And a stranger had to actually tell Joseph that this is where they went, they weren't here. Once the brothers laid eyes on Joseph, they began their plot to kill him and decided to throw him in a pit. One of the brothers, named Reuben, we're going to learn to like Reuben. Reuben has a good head on his shoulders. We just like Reuben. Reuben had Joseph's back and told his brothers not to shed blood. Okay, they were like, look, do whatever, but just don't kill the boy. And so they thought about it and they just throw him in the pit. Reuben actually had plans to return and get his brother out later. And so the brothers really thought this plan through. They threw him in the pit, but not before they took his robe, his coat of many colors, and put like animal's blood all over it and gave it to their dad. How would you feel if your kids were like, oh hey, your favorite youngest son, he's dead, he got mauled by an animal or something, and this is his robe? Don't even bring Joseph back, they just bring his robe back. Well, this tore Jacob up big time. Meanwhile, Joseph was actually sold to Potiphar, and Potiphar is basically like the chief of police to Pharaoh, okay? He's just the head honcho of security and all that stuff. So now in chapter 38, it is kind of somewhat, it's basically a side note. You can read it if you want, but it doesn't have much information that continues the story. So we're going to go to chapter 39. And in chapter 39, Joseph is pretty successful working in Potiphar's household, and he's actually found favor with Potiphar, so much so that Joseph is put in charge of the whole household. He runs the household. He tells everybody what to do. He's the butler of Potiphar's household, if you will. In verse 6, it kind of gives us, well, I won't say it's a side note. I'll just say that it kind of gives us somewhat of an explanation, I guess. In verse 6, it tells us that Joseph was very handsome. And this was something that Potiphar's wife noticed. She did not keep her eyes to herself. And after some time, she demanded that Joseph sleep with her. Now, Joseph, being the good boy that he is, he politely, lets her down, but she was not having it. She was bound and determined to make this happen. And one day, she actually grabbed Joseph by his clothes, demanding this. And when Joseph ran away, he left his clothes in her hand. Like he didn't think twice. He was just out of there. So what did Potiphar's wife do with this? She went to her husband and she lied about Joseph and said that he made a move on her. So she's trying to use this, I guess, what she's wanting to be evidence and holding it against Joseph. So we could say so many things about her, but you know what? We won't, because we love the Lord. So she goes and she lies to her husband, causing him to just outrage, go off the handle, and he ends up throwing Joseph in prison. Now, this is a very pivotal time in this story, and it has a big to do with the outcome of this story. And so, although Joseph ended up in prison, the Lord remained with Joseph the whole time, because you know what? He's with us all day, every day, 24/7. And while in prison, Joseph encounters two cellmates who have had dreams, and one of them happens to be the king's cupbearer, and the other one happens to be a baker. I guess also working for the Pharaoh. And the cupbearer dreamed about a vine and grapes, meaning he would go back to his position, and Joseph reminded him, he was like, hey, don't forget me when you get to go back to your position and you get to be Pharaoh's cupbearer. Okay, keep me in mind now. Don't forget me. Well, the baker dreamed about 3 bread baskets, to which Joseph said, you have 3 days left until they hang you. So one got a very good reading on his dream, and the other not so much. But time passed after the cupbearer finally got to go back and work for Pharaoh. Time had passed, and did he remember Joseph? No. The answer is no. In chapter 41, Pharaoh shows up. Okay, 2 years later. 2 years. 365 times 2. That's what? Let's do the math. 0, 5, what, 6? No. 700 days? Good grief. 700 something days. And now Joseph is remembered. So in chapter 41, Pharaoh shows up 2 years later, and he has a dream. Well, he was in the Nile with 14 cows. Okay, 14, but 7 were healthy, they were plump, they were fat, they were beautiful, and the other 7 were just skin and bones. Absolutely no meat. They were not healthy. They did not look good. They were scary. Well, he had another similar dream, but with grain. And so he called everyone, but no one could figure out what it meant. Nobody could interpret his dreams. Well, the cupbearer, those 700 whatever days, finally remembered him, pops up and realized, oh, shoot, I've completely forgotten about Joseph, and goes on to give Pharaoh a backstory. Hey, when I was in prison, I had this dream. I told it to this man, Joseph. Joseph told me what it meant, and lo and behold, he told me the truth. I was put back in my position as your cupbearer. The other guy, well, you hang him. And so Pharaoh got Joseph there ASAP. Got him cleaned up, new clothes, gave him a bath, brought him, and tells Joseph the whole story and asks him if he can help. Joseph said, well, I can't help you, but God can. So Pharaoh tells Joseph his dreams, and Joseph tells him what they mean. And he says both dreams mean the same thing. So for 7 years, Joseph is finally not, it didn't take Joseph 7 years to tell him what his dream means, but Joseph explained to him that his dream meant for 7 years This place is going to be plentiful. I mean, your harvest is just going to keep coming and coming and coming and coming. Well, the other 7 are 7 years of famine and drought. And no one is going to remember these 7 good years that you're going to have. They're only going to be living in the misery of this famine and drought. So now Joseph is telling him to find a wise man and get him going on the food. Like, find you a wise man who knows how to get this food in and save it for 7 years, because the next 7 years you're not going to have this. Well, eventually Pharaoh chooses Joseph himself as the wise man because he's got the Spirit of God. Joseph is now the head honcho. And keep in mind that Joseph is only in his 30s and is essentially running a country. Like, he's the VP. Okay, Pharaoh's the president and Joseph is the vice president. I'm 29 and I could not imagine running a country, which, granted, I guess Egypt is not as big as the US, and Egypt was not like it is today, obviously. But that's still crazy to me that he was only 30 years old and was running a country. So, once in charge, Joseph gets going on storing the food, and in the meantime, he has 2 sons with a priest's daughter that he's, I guess, married to, and both of their names have great meaning. You can go look up their names and see their meaning, but it just relates to Joseph's story. And then the famine came, and so did Joseph's brothers, looking for food nonetheless. So Jacob sent 10 of Joseph's brothers to Egypt for food, but not Benjamin, because he didn't want him to get hurt. Baby Benjamin, he wanted to keep him safe. He did not want him to get out and something happened to him. So Joseph is in charge of the grain getting sold, right? He is the cash register, I don't know. And he's the sales clerk, whatever you want to call him. And he recognizes his brothers immediately when they bow down to him, but they have no idea. So Joseph's brothers pop up. Joseph's like, oh man, these are my brothers. But the brothers have no idea that it's Joseph. They just bow down to him. He takes this moment as any hurt human might and is ugly to his brothers and accuses them of being spies. Out of all things, I don't know if spies would have been it, but that's just what he was feeling. So they go back and forth, to do ta-da. And Joseph ends up putting them in the slammer for 3 days. Rightfully so, I feel. Joseph makes a bargain and says, I'll let you go and take grain if you leave a brother here and bring back the youngest. Because remember, when Joseph was still with his family, Joseph was the youngest. So Joseph is now hearing this and is like, oh, all 10 of my brothers are here, but there's another one? And so they took this as punishment for Joseph. They're like, this is happening to us because of what we did to our brother. Still unaware that Joseph is front and center. And Reuben comes in saying, I told y'all. And they didn't know, but Joseph could understand them, and he got incredibly upset. So they were speaking in their own language, which was Joseph's language, because Joseph was their brother and was from where they were from, but they had no idea because they thought that he only, Arabic? He was speaking the language of the Egyptians. Well, Joseph, he had to turn around and compose himself. He was just tore up. He gave them their grain and returned their silver, which confused the brothers. So he didn't outright just put it in their hands. They figured out that Joseph gave them their silver when they were on their way home, and they looked in their bags of food and they were like, oh, this is the silver in which I paid for this. Well, when they got home, they gave their dad a rundown. They gave Jacob, Israel the rundown. They were like, hey, this is totally what happened while we were gone. So now Jacob thinks that he is down 2 sons, and they want to take Benjamin. So he's like, oh my gosh, I've already lost 1 son. Then y'all lost me another son, and now you want to take Benjamin? That would be 3 sons that I'm down, okay? Just probably just having a panic attack. I don't know. He's probably raging. Who knows? So Reuben was like, look, Pops, I'll take care of it. I'll take care of Benjamin. I'll take him, and if something happens, then you can take my own 2 children and end them. I mean, that's like Reuben was like, look, if anything happens to Benjamin, you can take my children and just take them out. Well, Jacob said no. He said no. And now they've run out of food again. And were told to go back. But they remembered that they better have Benjamin if they go and see Joseph again. That was the stipulation. So now they head back with double the silver and Benjamin in tow. Joseph sees them and Benjamin and goes to his steward and tells him to go and slaughter an animal and cook it because they were going to eat with him at noon. Now, all of the brothers are afraid, but the steward tells them not to be, just go back and read that because that's a cute little, don't be afraid, this is, yeah. When Joseph arrives, they bow down to him. Whoop. Joseph asks if they are well and if this was their youngest brother. They told him about, if this was their little brothers that they told him about. And this really got Joseph going, and he had to step away and wipe his tears. He had to leave the room and compose himself and wipe his eyes. We've all been there, Joseph, it's fine. He then sat down and they ate. They sat down from youngest to oldest, a whole order of operations at the dinner table. And in chapter 44, we find that Joseph gives his final test to his brothers. Joseph gets his people, or whoever, to plant his cup at the top of Benjamin's bag. His bag of grain or whatever they purchased. And, lets them leave and then gets them to pursue Benjamin. Well, not necessarily specifically Benjamin, although they knew it was Benjamin, but to pursue the brothers. And once they were brought back, they made their cases, and Joseph says that everyone can go, but the one who has my cup. He says that he will be my slave. And this got Judah all tore up. Man, we are so full of emotions. This got Judah all tore up and telling the whole story again from front to back. And it ends up trying to get Joseph to keep him and let Benjamin go. So Judah's battle 2 cents bargain is, hey, just let Benjamin go, keep me here, I'll be your slave. Well, in chapter 45, Joseph is finally done hiding, and he finally tells his brothers who he is. He sends everyone away who isn't in his family, who isn't one of his brothers, and he just starts wailing. Joseph is just having a hormonal moment, and he's wailing so loud that basically probably all of Egypt heard him. Everybody in Pharaoh's household, everybody in the neighborhood, everybody, that's how loud he was. Well, he tells his brothers that he is Joseph and asks about their dad. And it took a bit of convincing, but his brothers finally got it. They were finally like, whoa, this is Joseph. And he tells them to go home and bring their dad back, and they can bring their families and settle in Goshen. When Pharaoh hears about this, he told Joseph that he would hook his fam up with the good land, and they all listened. Pharaoh was like, oh, this is amazing. Bring your family here, and I will give them the best land, So exciting. Jacob, Israel, however you would like to address him, was hyped to go see his son again. He was like, what do you mean he's alive? Just take me. So in chapter 46, God reassures Jacob. Okay, he's like, look, this is good. Thumbs up. Jacob makes it to Egypt, where he says he can now die because he has seen Joseph's face and knows that he is alive. Pharaoh now meets Joseph's family, and like he promised, he hooks him up with the land. He hooks him up with the good land, and he even makes sure that they have the livestock and allows them to take care of his livestock. They're like, "Oh, that's your occupation? You're now in charge of my animals." At this point, we learn that Jacob is 130 years old and that they are settled in their new land. The people at this point have run out of silver. They've run out of money. And so Joseph says, okay, you don't have any money, you don't have any silver. Let's trade some livestock. So that really was like a win-win. You can have food if you give me some of your animals. So Joseph basically, at the end of all of this, got he got so much land in Egypt because people had sold their land to be able, due to the famine, their crops were not good, so they couldn't afford the land, so they sold it. But this actually worked out for both parties because it was like, what's the word? I want to say sharecropping. Like if they did plant something, Pharaoh would get a percentage of it and then they would get a percentage of it. So it worked out for both parties. In chapter 48, Jacob is on his last leg. He's in his bed. Everybody goes and tells Joseph that your dad he's about to clock out, man. And so Joseph brings both of his sons to go see Jacob. And once Jacob realizes that they're there, he sits up with all his might. And he, is saying his goodbyes, I guess you could say. Jacob has his last speech, I guess you could call it, telling about each son, aka the 12 tribes of Israel. So that's something else I want to talk about later, but the 12 tribes of Israel are basically, yes, the country of Israel, but remember Jacob's name is also Israel, and then he has the 12 sons. So that's just, think about that. Something to ponder on. Jacob, also gives his instructions on how he wants to be buried. And once he's finished giving his instructions, he pulls his feet back up on the bed, curls up, gets comfy, I guess, and he passes away. He breathes his last. So at this point, they buried Jacob, and now Joseph's brothers are getting a little paranoid. They're like, now that dad is gone, Joseph is probably going to tear us up. He's fixing to do something to us. Well, they are trying to get right with Joseph, I guess. Maybe not get right, but they're trying to plead their case, and they're trying to get good with Joseph where he didn't do anything bad to them. And Joseph tells him, he says that, you planned things of evil for me, but the evil things that you did for me, God ended up using them for good. And so he's like, how can I keep that grudge? How can I hold that against you? The story of Joseph and the book of Genesis actually ends with Joseph dying at the age of 110. So he doesn't live as long as his dad, but I mean, Joseph lived a very meaningful, impactful, just kind of like superhero life. He had tragedy, but the tragedy allowed him to go to Egypt and eventually get good with Pharaoh and be able to save so many people because he knew what Pharaoh's dream meant and he knew how to think that through and make it where all of these people could survive and would have something to eat during the famine. Now, do we know why the famine happened? Not exactly, but my guess would be because that brought his brothers to him and it reunited his family. And so Joseph's last request after all of this was said and done was, he talks about how they're going to get the land that God promised to Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. They are going to go back to this promised land, and Joseph is like, God is going to aid you, and when he does, take my bones with you. Which, kind of sounds like, what do you mean your bones? But essentially, it's kind of like Joseph saying, hey, take me with you. I want to make it to the promised land myself. And so this story, whether you've watched the animated movie or you've watched the VeggieTales version, this story is definitely probably one of the better known stories. It is an iconic story, and it kind of gives you a couple of insights. One of them is no matter what your family has done, in the end, y'all can work it out and be together again. And, it just tells you how God is good and He gives you the strength and the perseverance and just the mindset to be able to do the things that Joseph did. And that was to, save the people from going hungry and keep Egypt, prosperous and all that stuff. So if you're just now kind of starting because you haven't been here before, this podcast is like my mind. There is no just one direction. And so Joseph ends the book of Genesis, but if you go back to season 1, I do have the story of Moses that takes place right after this. So I would recommend going back and listening to that one if you want to go in chronological order. Is that the right word to use? Not numerical, but yeah. So anyways, I hope that you enjoyed this story time and just diving into God's Word again with me this time. And I hope you are doing well. And just know that I am praying for you. And I'll see you on the next one. So bye.